Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, mysterious voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I've found in my travels. Today it is Poetry Thursday, so I wanted to talk about some poetry, but also some spooky or darker themed poetry because it is Spooktober. And I wanted to also talk about a poet that I've talked about on this channel before, who I've had nothing but praise for. Today's poem is all about an indescribable feeling. I am referring to It Was Not Death, For I Stood Up by Emily Dickinson. I don't need to go into that great a detail because I've talked about her on this channel before, but for those who don't know, Emily Dickinson was a poet from the 1800s, an American poet, known for writing darker or more emotional based poetry, often about what appears to be things she just saw while she was isolated at her home. So like a lot of her poetry didn't get published while she was alive. Her family found it and published it afterwards, and that always brings up the question of whether she wanted that poetry published or if those were just her private writings and if she didn't think they were actually good enough to get published. But that's not really something we can really solve at this point, but it's always important to consider. A lot of her poetry is darker, but people have speculated that she must have had depression, but they didn't really have a name for that. Or they did, but they didn't really have therapy back then. And I'm always happy to talk about Emily Dickinson here because her poetry is pretty solid. So without further ado, I will read this poem, which is It Was Not Death, For I Stood Up. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. It was not death, for I stood up. It was not death, for I stood up, and all the dead lie down. It was not night, for all the bells put out their tongues for noon. It was not frost, for my flesh I felt siroco's crawl, nor fire, for just my marble feet could keep a chancel cool. And yet it tasted like them all. The figures I have seen set orderly for burial reminded me of mine, as if my life were shaven and fitted to a frame, and could not breathe without a key, and 'twas like midnight, when everything that ticked has stopped, and space stares all around, or grisly frost, first autumn morns, repeal the beating ground. But most like chaos, stopless, cool, without a chance or spar, or even a report of land to justify despair. And so that was It Was Not Death, For I Stood Up. In terms of analysis, there's a fair bit to talk about with this poem. And kind of like with most Emily Dickinson poems, I don't completely understand what I'm reading because she has a very unusual writing style, relying a lot on hyphens and capitalizing unusual words, which could just have been accidental on her part. But it strikes me as something that she would have done on purpose. But what reason she chose to do that, it remains to be seen. In terms of narrative, there's no strict narrative for this poem. The narrator is describing a feeling that they're having and talking about like the feeling and in terms of what they're not feeling, which I think is interesting. There's a note that specifically says that what this is it's apophasis or paralepsis when you talk about something by denying what it isn't or denying like other things about it. So she says specifically, it was not death, for I stood up, and all the dead lie down. It was not night, for all the bells put out their tongues for noon. Which is very interesting because when you're describing an emotion, usually you say what it is, but here it's saying, well, I'm not feeling this because it's not that. And as you go further into the poem, you see exactly what she might be feeling. She says, when everything that ticked has stopped and space stares all around, or grisly frost first autumn morns and repeal the beating ground. but most like chaos stopless cool without a chance or spar, or even a report of land to justify despair. And I think what Dickinson is getting at there is that she's feeling despair, and she's describing it when everything that ticked has stopped. So a feeling like something is very off, and things aren't quite what they should seem. And so, but this could be another thing where like she's talking about despair, but not exactly feeling that, because she might not have the words for this emotion that she's going through, that the narrator is going through. I should also note that this poem is somewhat prophetic, because in the third verse she says, "And yet it tasted like them all. The figures I have seen set orderly for burial reminded me of mine." Which is very interesting because it says, "set orderly for burial reminded me of mine," but like the narrator wasn't buried unless they're a ghost in this poem. And I'm choosing to read this from Emily Dickinson's perspective. Why would something remind her of her burial? Unless this was sort of like a prophecy, her having a vision of the future, of a very dark future in which she dies, and she feels despair at having thought about that. And a lot of Emily Dickinson poems feel prophetic in that way, but more so than that, they read like someone who has a very deep-seated depression, who's not getting the help they very well need, and so that's all that's on their mind: thoughts of death, thoughts of maybe suicide, thoughts of the end of it all, thoughts of the eternity of darkness and whatnot. And so that feels like significant here because as I mentioned before, she tends to capitalize random words, and she says the figures I have seen, and she capitalizes figures, possibly the people who are around her at her funeral, or possibly the specters of death that are carrying her off into the afterlife. So it does feel a bit prophetic, and it also makes me really wish that Emily Dickinson got therapy back in the 1800s, because to kind of feel this kind of stuff, or to be able to describe this kind of feeling of sort of despair, of chaos and whatnot, it certainly sounds like she was dealing with quite a bit. This isn't just me guessing at that, because a lot of her poems are described this way. And if someone writes so much of this, either they have a really active imagination, or they've personally dealt with this kind of thing before. So, very interesting poem that helps get more into Emily Dickinson's mindset. Anyway, so those are my thoughts on "It Was Not Death, For I Stood Up" by Emily Dickinson. A solid poem, maybe not so much October themed, but it does talk about death and feelings of despair, which I consider to be in line with Spooktober. Maybe mining people's mental health for spooky stuff is not the best idea, but she's long since dead, so we can worry about that some other time. If you have any thoughts on this poem, let me know in the comments below. Would love to have a discussion with you about this. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that more people can find out about this poem or this poet if they don't already know. Also join the Discord if you want to have more conversations about books or movies or whatnot. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and despair-feeling travels. Farewell.